Uh, Good afternoon. We are here to talk about the role of intermediaries. And in talking about that, we will use as a text for students. Isn't it always nice to have a textbook? Text, a research product that just came out of collaboration between Canadian Center for Law and Democracy and the Indian Internet Center, the Delhi-based the Center for Internet and Society, and also Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information at the University of Palermo. That's an Argentinian think tank. OpenNet Korea, and also Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, and also Canada-based Munch School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. The final product is titled Stand Up for Digital Rights. And as a moderator, I'll first go through what the final recommendations are. And you can listen to them carefully and see if they are appropriate recommendations. Especially industry reps, the recommendation go to you, so it will be interesting what your reactions are. And also the experts on the panel were requested to read them and respond to them as well. So. Okay, the recommendations are divided into 6 categories. The first is expanding access, expanding people's access to the internet. The second is net neutrality. Third is content moderation. Fourth is privacy. Fifth is transparency. And sixth area is responding to state censorship. So the recommendations under the first area, which is, okay, I'm not making the sound. Okay, just imagine you are sitting by the ocean. Sounds like waves, yeah? So for expanding access, can you click on expanding access? Okay, yeah. Let's just go on, yeah. Okay. Can you click on expanding access? Yes. So the recommendation for expanding access. The first one is on infrastructure. Can you go down? It's in small letters. Internet access providers should invest a reasonable proportion of their profits in expanding the infrastructure for providing access to the internet, particularly so as to reach underserved communities, including potentially through entering into public-private partnerships to advance this goal. And also cost measures. Internet access providers should consider funding or otherwise supporting programs or schemes designed to support access for poorer households, and internet access providers should work to mitigate or eliminate pricing differentials between rural and urban customers. I'll just read on. On accessibility, private sector online intermediaries should promote the development of content of relevance to less connected communities and or in smaller languages, and awareness raising in those communities and language groups about the potential of the internet. And intermediaries should promote accessibility for the disabled by adopting the Worldwide Consortium's web content accessibility guidelines. Other issues. Internet access providers should make reasonable efforts to monitor attempts by governments to adopt legislative rules which unduly undermine the expansion of access to the internet, and should engage in or support awareness raising and advocacy efforts to combat such moves. So these are very tough duties. These are really very tough duties that we are putting on the internet access providers. We are asking the providers to lobby against anti-access government measures. Finally, internet access providers should never cut off access or deny service to a user unless required to do so by a clear and binding legal order. Around the world, we find many times the internet service providers cut off the access even when there is no legal binding order from court. Even at the suggestion of some high officials, the access is cut off. We are recommending against that. The second set of recommendations on net neutrality. I'm not going to go through all of it because some of them is basic, but can you go down a little bit more? The first set is that internet access providers should respect net neutrality. Let's go to the second set. Net neutrality and expanding access. This one concerns zero rating. So see what we have got here. Programs to expand access to the internet which offer trade-off in terms of service or connectivity should be designed in an open and non-exclusive, transparent manner which respects net neutrality and the right of users to choose what material they wish to access. For such programs, the goal of giving the access provider a competitive advantage should not undermine the broader goal of connectivity. Okay, the second recommendation probably is much sharper. Program to expand the access that employ zero rating, i.e. provide free access to certain select application services, should be avoided unless it can be demonstrated clearly that these are significantly more effective than similar programs which do not offend net neutrality. Access providers which offer such programs should make available information about their effectiveness for purposes of independent verification. So the idea is that zero rating can be permitted, zero rating is permitted, but the companies providing zero rating have affirmative duty, has the burden of proving that the zero rating expands access. Is it my location? No. Is it my height or? Okay. All right, the next sort of recommendation is on content moderation. I'll just talk about the ones that are salient. So on clarity and communication, look at the third one. Look at the third recommendation on content moderation. Policies to address problematic content such as deletion or moderation which go beyond formal legal requirements. What we mean by that is there are unlawful material that are moderated, but there are times that the service providers, there are times that platforms take out lawful content for quality purposes, or just to, or for marketing purposes, or not to offend other users. Okay? So when the platforms do that, that should be done according to, it should be based on clear and predetermined policies which can be justified reference to a standard which is based on objective criteria, such as just letting everybody know that this is a family-friendly service, right? If you just pronounce that it's a family-friendly service, the platform's power to take out the content should be expanded. That's what we are saying, which are set out in the policy and which is not based on ideological or political goals. Where possible, intermediaries should consult with their users when determining such policies. And process for the next set, process for receiving and adjudicating complaints. We have a recommendation on that. So on the second one, they should have in place process to track abuses of their content moderation systems. The trolls to suppress the voices of women and other minorities. They send a lot of complaints on their postings. And because of the amount of complaints, sometimes women's postings or accounts are shut down. That's what we mean by abuse. So should apply more careful scrutiny to claims from those users who repeatedly file frivolous or abusive claims. The second recommendation, the notification, this one, the notification should include a reference to the legal, or notification is when you take down a content, you send notification to the user, right? That notification should include a reference to the legal or policy rule in question and an explanation of the procedure being applied and the opportunities available to the user to provide input before a decision is taken and common defenses to the application of the procedure. And the last one, the next one. There, where possible, subject to reasonable resource and technical constraints, users should be given a right to appeal against any decision to take action against the content at issue. I know that not all platforms give right of appeal to individual content takedown. We are recommending that for each takedown, there should be right of appeal for the person who posted it. And on restricting content, where action is taken against content, the intermediary should, subject to reasonable and technical constraints, retain means to reverse that action for as long as any appeal against the action remains pending. All right. And the fourth set of recommendations is on privacy. So maybe you can leave and click on privacy. On privacy, communicating with the users. There. Intermediaries should publish clear and transparent information about their policies and practice regarding the collection, processing, and sharing of user information. So note that the recommendation is not just about private information, but all user information. So yes, for public information, the platforms have a lot of freedom to use it without consent. But still, if you are using it, you should let the users know how it's being used, even if it doesn't require consent. The second recommendation, intermediaries should make sure that any representations they make to users regarding privacy or anonymity are clear and reasonable, and they should respect those commitments. Okay, let's go all the way to anonymity. Go down. There, intermediaries should take into account the human rights impact of real name registration policies and should work to mitigate any negative impacts, including by allowing use of pseudonyms or by allowing parts of the service to be used anonymously. We spend a lot of time why a mandatory real name law is bad. But even in jurisdictions where there is no such mandatory law, some companies choose to run their services on a real name basis. But if you do that, there is a human rights impact. And the last one is on right to be forgotten. The third recommendation, search engines should respect due process when applying the right to be forgotten if they have to, including by informing those whose content is subject to removal request as far as this is legally permitted and by giving them an opportunity to argue that the material should not be blocked, including because the public interest lies in continuing to display the content, and consideration should be given to putting in place some sort of appeals or reconsideration mechanism. As far as I know, there's no platform right now who gives right of appeal on right to be forgotten request. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I think this is something that all platforms should think about. All right, the fifth set is on transparency. I'm not going to speak much about it because we had like a couple sessions on transparency already. We are basically recommending all platforms and network operators to publish transparency reports. And the last set, maybe you can come out, yes, on state censorship. Let me just look at the third set, pushing back. Right. Intermediaries should notify if you look at the second one, intermediaries should notify users who are the subject of a request from a state actor as soon as they are legally allowed to. In many jurisdictions, when platforms receive takedown orders from the governments, formally or informally, they take it down without notifying the person who posted that content. And I think that is inimical to the role of the internet. So I'll stop here. So I just cover the salient points of the recommendation, or I'll say possibly controversial points. If you want to, during the session, if you want to read more carefully, there is a URL at the top. If you just take the top URL, then you can then go down to look at the detailed parts of the recommendation. Having introduced the recommendations, it's time for the experts to respond to the recommendations and also give us insight about what other recommendations they can make. We'll go in the order of sitting here. So Professor Ang Peng-hwa, can you go first? Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay, this is an issue that I had worked on some time back, and I really feel like Bill Clinton once said that he was the youngest guy in the room, and now he's the oldest guy in the room. And now I'm also one of the oldest guys in the room, along with Marcus and Paul. 5 minutes, okay, sure. I'll keep it to 5 minutes too. This is an important subject because actually it impinges a lot of e-commerce. It cuts across e-commerce. And this has to do with the fact that e-commerce platforms are intermediaries. And what we're doing is looking at the issue of, actually the issue is limited immunity for intermediaries. And how do you handle the conditions for which it should be accorded immunity. This report though goes beyond that. This report actually suggests some other duties or tasks that intermediaries can embark upon. But let me talk only about the immunity part of it. The first country in the world to have immunity for what we call network service provider was Singapore. It was the first law in the world to immunize both civil and criminal laws. But it's limited, in a sense, it's limited only to network service provider. It doesn't say intermediary, the word is network service provider. The US came in a few days later, literally a few days later, and they immunized civil liability totally. If you're intermediary, you're immune entirely civilly, including something like defamation law. So there are cases where defamatory content was left up there, and then when the person was defamed, put up a note to the company in question, the case AOL literally sat on the hands and did nothing. The person suffered because it was mistaken and all that, but nothing was taken against AOL. So I see something like this as trying to balance the competing interests of the intermediaries, but also potential victims, those who will be harmed for content. So let me talk about some other areas where this comes in. TripAdvisor, I think many of us use it on this, I still use it on this trip. Amazon reviews. These all have intermediary roles. And then the question is, what if a review is defamatory, if it's wrong, it's erroneous? Should TripAdvisor or Amazon be held liable? And the general sort of trend is to say that you're given some, globally speaking, you're given some immunity if you remove the content within a specified number of days. In the case, however, of US, what it means is there's total immunity for Amazon and then TripAdvisor if it's in the US. In Singapore, TripAdvisor and Amazon will not be immune, but the carriers would be immune. Those who provided the service for TripAdvisor and Amazon. So where do we stand on this issue? Where has the state of the art moved to? It is really moving to balance competing interests. I mentioned that. So I think that the general trend is towards immunizing civil liability, but not criminal liability. Generally civil liability, which means actually even defamation law, copyright, depending on how whether it's copyright civil or criminal, copyright law to some extent. So some immunity there, but also some notice to take down, meaning that you are immune if you do take down a notice within a certain period of days. Some talk about whether 1 day is too quick a time. Yahoo tells me that it takes 5 days to remove content globally because of how this materials are cached globally. So up to 5 days, but certainly within a certain period of time. So I see this report as trying to balance those competing interests. What is new in this report, though, like I said, is the recommendations that go beyond immunizing intermediaries for liability, but going beyond to talk about some positive duties, or suggestion of positive duties that should be undertaken. And that, I think, is what we'll really consider and discuss.
Okay, thank you. Next, Sarvit. Again, 5 minutes.
Discussion, I thought I'll just read out a few numbers about internet users in India, which may be relevant for this particular discussion. Recently, India became the second largest internet consumer base, and we currently have over 330 regulator has over the internet. And I had the chance to quickly go through the report. And what I'll do, I'll quickly run through how the various companies are dealing with some of these issues in India and some of the solutions. I'll start with access and go to net neutrality, and time permitting, briefly touch upon content moderation. So on the question of access, given that the markets in the US and Europe have saturated and most of these companies are not allowed to operate in China, India becomes the biggest market for them, and if they can get a lot of people connected, that's really beneficial for them, I would say economically. And a lot of these companies have started taking initiatives which are already underway, like providing free Wi-Fi at public places, and are waiting for regulatory approvals for some other initiatives. So Google is launching the project Zoom, which will provide internet through balloons in unconnected areas and other stuff. Facebook had launched a free basic initiative which was banned by the regulator in India. However, they have subsequently started rolling out other initiatives which provide access to the unconnected. And just to follow from the previous conversation and what I saw in this report, what we all need to be cautious that when rolling out these initiatives and to bring the unconnected online, that the companies respect net neutrality and the user's right to a plural and diverse media and information. And where we would disagree with this report is because we at Center for Communication Governance believe that any kind of zero rating violates the right to freedom of expression that is guaranteed under the Indian Constitution and the International Convention of Civil and Political Rights. The other initiative that these companies need to take is to make local language content more accessible and available. For example, in India, only about 12% of the population speaks English, yet almost 65% of the content is available in English, and a large number of languages or dialects remain unrepresented. And the other thing is that they need to partner with local institutions to bridge the gender and the urban and rural divide. For like in India, only 29% of users are women, and this is reduced significantly to only 12% in rural areas. And the other major area where the internet intermediaries should take a leading role is the issue of network shutdown. And this is becoming like a cause of major concern in India. Recently, we have done some work with Access Now and have documented around 28 instances of shutdown since 2015. Out of these, 14 instances have been recorded just within this year. And the longest being almost 19 days. So for almost 3 weeks, people in the state of Jammu and Kashmir did not have access to internet or mobile phones. And that apart from just restricting, I would say, the freedom of expression, the other thing that it does, it also has a negative economic effect. And that's where possibly the civil society organizations, the advocacy groups, and the tech companies can come together and demand answers from the government and maybe put a legal challenge against this. To quickly go through the content, I'll just start and then take questions. Yeah.
Thank you for starting posing. Okay. Shall we go? Good morning.
Okay. I'm Kelly Kim from OpenNet Korea. And regarding the recommendations for responsible tech, especially recommendations for content moderation and recommendations for privacy have particular importance in Korean case. So if may I give you a brief background regarding Korean intermediary liability regime. First, like regarding content moderation, our law allows online content moderation in two types. First is an administrative censorship by this administrative body called the Korean Communication Standard Commission, KCSC. This KCSC issues each year more than 100,000 correction requests that are actually content removal requests upon the standard of sound communication ethics. So this KCSC can make requests which they claim to be not binding to internet intermediaries to take down these contents that are in violation of like sound communication ethics. And although they claim the request is not binding, it has almost 100% compliance by the intermediaries. And second, content removal in response to private parties' requests. So according to the Information Communications Network Act, anyone can make a request to intermediaries to take down contents that are infringing on his or her rights, something like defamatory content or like privacy infringing content. And similarly, under the Copyright Act, anyone can request intermediaries to take down allegedly copyright infringing contents. Although the law can be read as providing safe harbor to the intermediaries, someone like notice and takedown system under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of the US, Korean intermediaries have chosen to interpret the law as these both laws as a mandatory requirement. So especially notice and takedown under the Information and Communications Network Act, many public figures, professionals, and celebrities use this notice and takedown or this request, a private party request takedown system to take down any unfavorable information about them which are online. So I must say this is much powerful than the right to be forgotten, which is just a right to request intermediary to delist content about somebody. So as a result, the intermediaries are forced to take down thousands of contents daily, which they believe even to be perfectly lawful in Korea. And second, regarding protection of privacy and mass surveillance, Korean laws, surveillance laws are in general not dissimilar from other countries, except that the state notification to those under surveillance are delayed until the end of the investigation after the indictment decisions are made. However, like overbroad surveillance requests are often filed. And regarding online anonymity, user identity requests or subscriber identification data request issues is very concerning in Korea. Our Telecommunications Business Act allows intermediaries to release subscriber information, like identification data, to the investigative authorities without a warrant or any judicial order and without any notification to the users. And intermediaries nearly always comply, even though the request, the request is not mandatory. Well, silver lining here is that largest Korean internet intermediaries, Naver and Kakao, and few more are refusing to comply with the request since 2012 following a court decision. However, the problem is that telcos still comply, and the numbers, the number is actually growing, and about 13 million people's ID information was given in year 2014 alone. And Korea is a country with like 50 million people. So, well, regarding surveillance, intermediaries have a very narrow ability to exercise any right favoring discretion. However, it is, as I just mentioned, these leading intermediaries like Naver, Kakao, and Google have kind of fought back against those non-mandatory subscriber ID data requests, and also they focused on they're focused on publishing transparency reports and adopting privacy favoring technologies. So as you can see, internet intermediaries play a pivotal role in delivering human rights in Korea, and
many of the restrictions on free speech and privacy come in the form of soft law. And the Manila Principles on Intermediate Library, which was published in Manila March last year, has been very helpful for us, our civil society, to fight against draconian intermediate liability regime in Korea. And these recommendations, so much, like, I must say it's much more ambitious and comprehensive than the Manila Principles, but I think it can be a very good guideline for both the civil society and the internet intermediaries. Thanks.
Thank you. Malavika?
Hi. Couple of different points. I'll pick on the privacy things more than any of the others because the others have covered consent and content and takedown and other things really well. And I wanted to make one sort of preliminary point, which is that even though this report actually focuses on the private sector, I would actually urge that it also apply in principle to civil society and to NGOs, because I find that post-Snowden, there was a lot of pressure on governments and on companies for the role that they play in data collection and surveillance. But the one sector that sort of remains invisible, but that handles a ridiculous amount of data, in fact, very personal, very sensitive data about people, is human rights organizations, aid workers, development organizations working in different countries, who often deal with incredibly sensitive data about health, about identity schemes, about welfare and benefits. And a lot of them, with the best intentions in the world, are not really aware of privacy and security trends or policies. And the assumption is always that they're the good guys, and therefore we shouldn't be sort of picking on them. So this is not to pick on them, but to sort of help them do their work better, because if they're putting their data in an unsecured way, or they're putting something in the cloud, or if they're not anonymizing information to the extent that it even can be anonymized, which we all know is like believing in Santa Claus, I think, you know, to some extent, they're putting the very users that they're seeking to help at risk. So I think it's not for lack of knowledge. It's, you know, if they're social scientists and health workers and development people, they're not trained to think in terms of, you know, encryption and security and where, you know, whether you use Google Docs, whether you use something else, what products and tools and services have been vetted for your particular threat model, especially given that there isn't a one-size-fits-all threat model for the world. So I would just urge that in a lot of the work that I've done, people tend to think that, well, I'm not dealing with data. And you think, look, have you ever touched a computer and a phone in your life? You're dealing with data. So I think to keep reinforcing that you don't have to be in the IT sector, you don't have to be a lawyer, to keep remembering that a lot of these principles would apply to you. You don't need to be Google or Facebook to take on these kinds of responsibilities. If you're handling people's information, you should be bound by rules like this. So I just wanted to sort of extend the scope of this report to help people. And I think it's not to sort of castigate them and say they're not doing their job, but to sort of give them the resources, the training, and the tools to actually help them implement a lot of these safeguards for very vulnerable populations at risk. The other couple of points I wanted to make is a lot of the recommendations in the report on the privacy section, I agree with a lot of them, but I think many of them, the critique I would have is, I have a couple of critiques. One is that they sort of push a lot of the responsibility back onto the user. I would urge that a lot of the responsibility for implementing privacy and security rests with the platform in terms of the architecture and the design. And it's something that came up in the morning as well when we had a panel on internet architecture and human rights. You know, the whole idea of the WHOIS infrastructure and the database and the human rights implications of that. And I think in the same way that you think of proxy services and masking services where people have to, if they want to, you know, if they want to remain or have some degree of anonymity or flexibility online, well, you have to pay for those services. And I think in the same way, this report also seems to ask that intermediaries give options for people who don't want their data to be used, where companies use data as their business model. They should give an option for people to opt out and say, well, charge me instead. And I think that sets us down a dangerous path. I don't like the idea of treating privacy as a luxury good. I don't like the idea of a power imbalance where some people can access privacy because they're willing to pay for it and other people are not. So I would say that the default position would be that you don't collect the data unless you absolutely need to. that it should be necessary and proportionate. And I think the report does a really good job of explaining what those sort of finely grained criteria are. It's just I have a little bone to pick with that idea of saying give people the option to pay for it. Because I think you will end up with a really distorted world if that happens. There are writers who've talked about it even in the West, like Julia Angwin and others who've talked about privacy as a luxury. But I think that's even more salient in the rest of the world, like where we are right now. The other thing I wanted to point out is when we're talking about privacy policies and terms and conditions and communicating to users, being clear, being unambiguous, which is hard because these are really complex transactions. You know, you're sharing data with a whole lot of people. So on one hand, you want to give people full information and be transparent. On the other hand, you want people to understand things and have the time to actually read through your privacy policy, which is a really difficult balancing act. And I say this as a lawyer who has drafted many of these terms. You know, do you give them full information or do you make it simple and readable? And it's a really tough balancing act. But I think as Daniel Soliv, who's one of my favorite privacy scholars, in his words, he says that privacy law or even privacy policies are tasked with work that's beyond their capabilities. We're expecting a privacy policy to set a standard, to sort of raise expectations, but also you're expecting people to read them, understand them, and we're sort of ignoring the sort of cognitive deficiencies and the structural biases that are inherent. So for example, you ask for consent and people believe consent is like this magic wand that you wave and suddenly everything is okay and you can do what you want because people have consented. But if the second you begin to unpack it and look at, is it really informed consent? Did they just click through something because they were desperate to pay for that concert ticket like 10 minutes before it started? Did they even know what they were signing up for? So in that context, he talks about a lot of reasons why consent is fundamentally broken. And one of them is about the fact that there's a temporal issue. You ask for consent once, you ask for it upfront. People consent at that single point in time because at that point they think the trade-off they're making is a valid one. I'll give you this data in exchange for this transaction. It's a one-off thing, that seems fine. Right now I need this desperately, I agree to this. They're not thinking of all the different actors, the multiplicity of actors that are involved who might then come in contact with the data, none of whom they will ever know about. They have no visibility of the entire sort of ecosystem. So that's one problem. And so I think there's also a lot of behavioral economics that's really helpful in nudging people towards helpful decisions around these. So I'll just close there.
Thank you. Thank you for insightful comments, especially directly on the recommendations. If anybody in the audience or in the panel also makes comments directly on the recommendations, you'll hear this compliment again. Last but not least, we'll hear from one of the intermediaries representative herself, Anki Das from Facebook. By the way, because I was distracted by the noise, I forgot to introduce people on the panel. Ang Peng-hwa, Professor Ang Peng-hwa from Nanyang University, Sarji from Center for Communication Governance at Delhi-based National University of Delhi. Kelly Kim from OpenNet, Malavika Jariam. She is newly appointed Executive Director for Digital Asia Hub, which will be a think tank to respond to various issues coming out of Digital Asia. So please give a round of applause to the panelists, which we forgot at the top of the session. Now, Anki, go.
Thank you. So I'll reflect on a couple of the principles which got covered in this your opening statements, and I'll sort of touch upon access and also respond to some of the points that you raised, Sarvajit, and of my 5 minutes I'll also use a minute to talk about content moderation. So in terms of expanding access, as a company, we are making appropriate investments in terms of improving last mile access infrastructure, which is a very major problem in India as well as in the South Asia region. There's a real need in terms of investing in last mile access infrastructure, and whether you like it or not, 95% or even more of those investments are coming from the private sector. So that is something which is something which we just have to. It's like the morning sun. We just have to recognize that fact. In terms of the investments which we as a company are making, in terms of the last mile access infrastructure in this region, is of course something which has gained a lot of currency, which is public Wi-Fi, and our Express Wi-Fi program essentially is creating village-level entrepreneurs to be able to provide last mile public Wi-Fi access services. And the main problem which we are trying to solve there is that what is the sustainable business model? What does it look like to provide this last mile access infrastructure? We are also working on something, this principally is being provided in rural areas. We are also working on something which is described as the Telegraph project, and that again looks at providing last mile access infrastructure in very congested towns where there is a gap in terms of typical mobile internet operators being able to provide that type of access infrastructure. Just last week, we had an event where our first solar-powered plane, unmanned aerial vehicle, Aquila, completed its test flight, and the goal is to sort of take that to scale after some deployment or some other test flights which are concluded, and use that device to service areas which cannot be connected by traditional operators and by traditional mechanisms. So those are the kind of things which we are doing on the access infrastructure side. At the same time, there is this big problem of affordability and relevance, and the report here recognizes that there are different types and different kinds of zero rating, to the extent that there are innovative business models or innovative business arrangements which are open, non-exclusive, and is equally accessible to all developers to access. Those kinds of zero rating should be permitted, and they are legitimate. We developed the Free Basics app. There was, of course, this long history there, and we have lots of stories from India to share from that. But Free Basics as an application is live in 44 countries, and it's working, and we have presented data. You talked about the burden of proof being on platforms to establish that it is actually bringing more people online, and we've placed data in the public domain where we have established that it has brought in excess of 25 million people, unconnected people online, and that has been shared and put in the public domain. So that's what we are doing on the investment side in terms of expanding access and connecting the next billion. On the content moderation side, there's some very well-established principles which have been recognized in the report. From a Facebook perspective, we take this very seriously. As you know, we are a GNI member company, and we are required to conduct independent assessment of our compliance with GNI principles and on free expression and privacy both, and we participate in that. We also regularly engage with civil societies, communities, and as well as are forever expanding the network of engagement which we have with civil society actors, experts, think tanks. We publish a transparency report twice a year and are very open to feedback. It's a progressive journey, and every cycle there is improvements which is added in terms of the transparency report. We also feel that our products themselves are important tools for counter speech and for advocating for human rights. And there are various programs which we are designing with community groups, with millennials, with civil society, to make sure that there is broader awareness and recognition as to how you can use counter speech to shine spotlight on bad legislation or bad trends, also the types of mobile internet bans which Sarabjit talked about.
Okay, thank you. So what do you think? Do you think Facebook has met the burden of showing that Free Basics expands access, genuine access? Yeah. Okay.
we have another set of recommendations in the form of a template notice that intermediaries or content platforms can use in notifying the users when they take down the content, or the notice template that the users are required to use, or the complainants are required to use in requesting takedown. We'll hear from someone sitting far from here, Jeremy Malcolm at Electronic Frontiers Foundation.
Hello,
okay,
can you
Jeremy,
hear me?
can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, and hopefully you can hear me too. So I'm not sure if I am able to advance the slides myself, so perhaps someone can do that
Okay,
for me if there's not a way
we
for
will
me to
we
do
will
it.
manage. So just let us know when you want to go to
But
the
anyway,
page.
we've heard a little about the Manila Principles on intermediary liability already, and it's not a project that's just been finished and we've moved on. In fact, we're continuing to work to improve the resources available through the Manila Principles website, and one of those is indeed this template notice to users when their content is restricted by an intermediary, often at the request of a third party. Now, I'm not seeing the slides on the screen. Can anything be done about that?
Okay, you are on the first page.
Okay,
You
I'm
are on
not
the cover
seeing
page.
anything.
You made it. Do you need to see it yourself now?
Okay, never mind. As long as
yeah.
you can see it, that's the main thing.
Right.
So that's fine. So let's just move on to the next slide, which is the outline. So I'll just be giving a little bit of background about why we did this, and then I'll be leading you through the notice itself. Then
okay,
we can
next slide, please.
We can skip ahead 2 slides until we get to the colorful table, which has the heading, How are users notified of content restriction? So I'm assuming that...
okay, there is a colorful table. How
yes,
are users notified of the content restriction? Go ahead.
So one thing that we found in looking at some of the jurisdictions around the world is that there's no consistency about when users have to be notified about their content being taken down for various reasons. It's very seldom required by the law that users receive any notice at all when their content is taken down. And so here's a little table which illustrates that for 5 of the jurisdictions around the world. The most common case where users do have to be notified is where their content is taken down due to a copyright claim. But for other sorts of claims, hate speech and privacy, they are not required to be notified when their content is taken down, and so therefore they don't. There's no incentive for the intermediary to warn them about that fact, and if they have any disagreement with the content being removed, they're not given any opportunity to object. So the worst case scenario is where there's even a limitation on them being notified that their content has been blocked, which is possibly the case for the right to be forgotten removals in Europe. So we thought that this was a bad situation that should be addressed. Can we move to the next slide, please? One of the other problems that we wanted to address was in the case where users' content is restricted under a legal process such as the DMCA, then they may be notified, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that is, they may be notified, but not when the same content is removed under the intermediary's terms of service. We wanted to make sure that these very similar situations were treated in the same way. In other words, that users should be notified when their content's removed, no matter whether it is removed due to a legal procedure or due to the internal application of terms of service. The effect on the user is the same, so they should be notified in the same way. Another problem we wanted to address is that intermediaries were simply forwarding notices that rights holders were writing to users, which may have been completely inaccurate. And there's an example of this in the case of Canada, where copyright owners were sending notices via ISPs that were completely inaccurate and claimed that users would be liable to US level penalties, when that wasn't the case, because they were Canadians, not Americans. So what we wanted to do was to try and make it easier for intermediaries to send out a notice to their users that would be accurate and that they could use for both when they're following a legal mandate or when they're applying their own terms of service. And the Manila Principles do provide for such a thing. If we can move on again to the next slide. The Manila Principles do say that intermediaries who host content may be required by law to forward a lawful and compliant request to the user. When forwarding the request, the intermediary must provide a clear and accessible explanation of the user's rights, including any counter notice or appeal mechanisms. So the Manila Principles do suggest that the intermediary do that, but they don't provide a template. So what we decided to do was to provide exactly that, to provide a template that the intermediary could use to generate a suitable notice for the user when their content has been restricted. So let's skip ahead to 2 slides. Yep, and the next one after that, where we will see just the first part of the... no, I think there should be one. There's an orange slide.
Yep.
We are seeing
I
it.
think you've gone too far. Just go... Yeah, there we go. So this is just part of the form. I'll give you the web address of the complete form, but this is just the first few fields of the form. And you can see here, you fill in who made the content request, content restriction request. In other words, if someone's asked for a user's content to be taken down, who were they, when did they make the request, where was the content found originally, that sort of thing. So there's about... it's a single page form, it's not that long, and the exact fields that you see will change based on your answers. So you may be asked, is this a copyright complaint? And then you'll receive further questions that are relevant to that. So the exact format of the notice will vary depending on your answers in this form. So moving ahead again to the next slide. This form is meant to apply to different areas of law. So if there's a complaint that the user's content infringes copyright or is defamatory or infringes someone's privacy, it's meant to be applicable for all of those reasons. And it's also meant to apply to different legal regimes, such as a notice and notice regime, a notice and takedown regime, and as I said, where there's an order from a court to take down content, or when it's simply a decision of the intermediary to take it down under their terms of service. And finally, it's meant to apply in different jurisdictions, different legal systems such as common law or civil law jurisdictions. So for this reason, it is pretty general, and we fully expect that it might be necessary to fine-tune the results of this, the outputs of this form before it's sent to the user. But nonetheless, it does provide a convenient, quick and easy way to rough up a draft notice to the user. Next slide, please. So just to clarify some things that we didn't intend that this would be used for, we didn't want to try and tell larger intermediaries like Google or Facebook that they should be using our notice generator, because clearly they don't need to. They've already got their own lawyers, they already know what they're doing. So this is really meant for the smaller intermediaries who maybe don't know what kind of notification they should be sending to their users. It isn't meant to be providing legal advice. It's not meant to supersede any legal requirements that specify the contents of a notice to users, which may exist in some jurisdictions, although unfortunately they don't really exist in most. But if a country does specify the format of a notice to the user, then that would prevail over our form.
Jeremy, I know you're a lawyer, but these are like set of disclaimers. Can you skip them and finish in 30 seconds?
Sure. Let's just skip ahead to 4 or 5 slides where it's okay. This will do. So how to use it? The address that you can see there is manilaprinciples.org/template. You can also find it under the menu that says Resources. If you click on Resources and then Notice of Content Restriction Generator under that menu item, you'll be able to get there. And we suggest that you don't assume that it's 100% correct. It may still have some bugs. So if you find any bugs, then please let us know. And then to the very final slide. Yeah, spread the word. Let us know if you find it useful, and if you don't, please tell us how to improve it. And you can contact me at EFF. My email address is on the first slide of this presentation deck, and so thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Just one question. Is Manila Principles still open for signature?
Yes, it is, and now that we are launching this, and we've also launched a new blog section on the website. So because of these new things just having been done, we're going to be doing another push to encourage more people to sign on. So it would be a good time to sign on. If we get a number of new signatories altogether, then we'll make an announcement and maybe blog about it. So it would be a good way to get some publicity.
Thank you. Manila Principles are making their headway into becoming international soft law. It's being cited by UN Special Rapporteur or Freedom of Expression, and it's likely to be cited by the Special Rapporteur on privacy as well, and many other UN originated documents. So to add to the impetus, I also urge individuals and organizations to look at the Manila Principles. Let's give a round of applause to Jeremy, who has spoke from afar. Okay, we have ample time for question and answers. Anyone in the audience? Yes, Chet first.
My question is to Malavika around the responsibility as well of other institutions or organizations that collect data, right? I mean, I suppose the Manila Principles, as I understand it, is for intermediaries. And I ask this question because I think maybe that's much more related to, let's say, I just came in the Philippines. We now have the Data Privacy Act, and I went to a consultation. And in fact, in that consultation by the government, because there now is a privacy commission, there were research organizations who did say, look, you know what, they're now concerned about what a responsibility is because of the Data Privacy Act. So maybe that's where it was much more relevant. And one thing that they did say was that they have much higher ethical standards in collecting data, protecting data, and in fact, working with data. Just question around why you feel that this is relevant for the intermediaries.
So my involvement came out because I was talking to HEVOS about funding that they gave to a lot of organizations, and they'd found that a lot of them didn't actually implement a lot of these principles. And so it's kind of similar to Rebecca McKinnon's approach with ranking digital rights. The idea was saying we sort of impose obligations on people to say, look, in the mining industry, with conflict diamonds, with minerals, with environmental protection, we actually rate people, or even for diversity, we rate companies and people based on how they implement those rules around ethical practices. So why aren't we doing the same when it comes to free speech, privacy? And so it sort of started off with that point of view, and it was sort of saying that a lot of these people with the best intention in the world were not implementing them, because some of it, where it was for research, you had students going off doing anthropological surveys in Africa, publishing something online, and the data never got back to the people that actually had generated it. They weren't asked for consent, they didn't get a chance to approve it or to delete it. So I think one sort of response was that there was no feedback loop where the data was actually effectively used by the communities that generated them. There was this sort of predatory relationship where it was, again, it sort of gets to this point of, who really owns data? And if somebody else is analyzing data, does the user have any rights in it if they didn't generate it themselves? And I think big data also sort of raises all these questions, because on one hand, if you're doing big data analysis, a lot of people's excuse is, well, it's all anonymized, it's aggregated, so there's no person as such for personally identifiable information, and therefore things like data privacy laws and data protection laws would not actually protect individuals, because they're not able to show that it was them individually, it was their data, but it was their membership of a class that still made assumptions about them or treated them in particular categories and stereotypes, which did affect their life choices. So if they were treated as a member of a class, they may not have got a loan because they were deemed to be high risk, even though that particular person may have been perfectly wonderful with their credit. So I think it was in those sort of contexts where we were looking at it, and it was more the point that a lot of these organizations are not trained to think about them. They don't think about what tools to use, that they put something in the cloud, or if they use Facebook to organize, they don't realize that in particular repressive governments, putting all these people's names and user information and their location information could be really life-threatening for them, not just in terms of intellectual privacy, but actual physical safety and security. Or even when it's anonymized, if there's a village of 15 people and you're talking about somebody who has HIV, it's very easy to know who that person is, even if you don't mention their name. And they could be ostracized in that community. So I think it was in this context of saying, when you're dealing with health, you're dealing with other sensitive scenarios, even though technically you may not be held to the same standards as a company, and even though ethically you may be functioning really well in your field, there's a limit to what your own expertise is when it comes to keeping that data safe and secure, and there's sort of onward, downstream usage of that data in a way that's respectful to the people that it relates to. So I think it was in that context that I meant it, that it's sort of saying, it's not like we expect them to live up to the same standards as a Facebook or Google, or that they have the same public responsibility, but maybe they can start getting there, and maybe we should help them get there in some way, because a lot of them they get hacked, they have data breaches. So for all of those reasons, I think they should also be handling data sensitively.
Thank you. Next, yes. Mic is coming from your behind.
Ms. Malaika, okay, I'm from Sina Project. What we do is transparency, and we release names. Names are very sensitive in some case. We have a line. The line is called politically exposed person. Sorry, I'm tired. Okay, the point is, depends on people. Some people deserve less privacy than others. We need to know the line. That's one. For us, our line is name only and not kids, for example. So, okay, keep it short. Privacy can impact our work. We need to know the line. Thanks. I need to know the line. What's the line that you got? Yeah.
Wow. That's the holy grail, if we knew where that line was. Like I said earlier, there is no one-size-fits-all. I think context would dictate what that is. In some situations, a name might be completely meaningless, but in some cases, like in India, a name might identify your caste or your religion and immediately place you in a social hierarchy. So your name can actually immediately identify various attributes about you, even if you never talked about them, right? In the way that, you know, Michael might be Christian and then Muhammad might be Muslim, right? It's that kind of thing. But it can be more finely grained than that in a lot of communities. It can indicate a tribe or something. So I think names can be really sensitive, but I think what you do and don't disclose also really depends on what your threat model is. But the one pushback I would have is on this idea that some people deserve privacy more than others. I think everyone deserves privacy. It's a human right. And Sunil Abraham from the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore made this really good point where he said, transparency is for those with power and privacy is for those without. And interestingly, I said that to a techie who completely resisted this idea, which I found fantastic because I expected a legal or a policy person to come back with this response, not a technical person. He said, I completely disagree with that. I don't think the power imbalance makes any difference. Everyone should have privacy. I think if you're a public figure, maybe certain of your professional activities may be more in the public domain, and the public may have a right to know what that is or have a public interest in it. But I think this idea that because you're public or because you're famous or a celebrity that you lose the right to have privacy in your personal life, like I would completely resist that. We all have a zone of intellectual, physical, spatial, temporal privacy that I don't think anyone should intrude into. I think we all have those basic rights. I think it's a sliding scale, and like, you know, what's appropriate, it will be dictated by circumstances.
Okay. Yes, Aman?
So I was curious a bit about the internet access related, material you put in there. For people who are not familiar, I'm Raman. I work with Access Now. I head its policy team. I was just curious in terms of the focus on ensuring investment in internet, and I totally get that in terms of it being a critical policy priority. But I was curious about why put it as a specific recommendation on the tech sector, particularly because the sort of examples you mentioned, and just by background, I worked also in the tech sector. I worked on some of these projects. I used to work at Google previously. I just found it interesting because some models that people talk about are definitely not-for-profit, probably just investment or like donation or purely philanthropic. Others of them are definitely business models. They might be like customer acquisition, or some of them might be even for-profit. You can talk about the Google, fiber projects, many other fiber projects that people are deploying. Some of the Wi-Fi projects that Microsoft experiments with also works on at least a cost model. So just curious why that specific recommendation in that model, and why I ask that is, and I appreciate the sort of thinking that's come on zero rating, although I probably agree with Sarojit that I wouldn't endorse the text as is, but I'm just curious in terms of why the focus on saying they must invest in this sector, because I think it misses the fact that some of them will do it for business reasons, and that's fine. And I would then jump, and I think this has happened a bit in some of the UN language and discourse on this, to just saying human rights should apply online and then apply many different principles there, rather than just at the top level say invest in the sector, and then saying on zero rating, this may be the broad test. So I was just a bit uncertain there. So what I'm trying to say is there are two concerns. One, in saying that you should invest means that you take away from the fact that some of the access solutions developed will be business models, and that's fine. I think that's okay. And that then takes away from the fact that you may want to do more specific discussions, say, for example, on drones or in balloons, not all of which, by the way, will be consumer facing. Some of them will be back end, right? They'll be backhaul or they'll be doing other stuff. Then you say privacy should apply, or protections against interception should apply, or mass collection of data. Maybe we need more norms there. So I'm just curious about that, because I think we preempted some of the further norm discussion that could happen in this space. And I fully admit that we could always have norm discussion, and the temptation is always there. But I'm just curious because this is one important one, and it's a slight flare point in the sector.
Well, I think as one of the drafters, maybe I should answer. I think that the recommendations were are to be taken as interweaving with one another, crisscrossing with one another. So, but we wanted to have one section where people approach intermediate responsibility from corporate, from traditional CSR perspective, where investment is always emphasized. That's just about concrete answer I can give. There was another question from Winston.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back very briefly to something that Malavika said. You mentioned the case of, I don't know whether it's a true case or a hypothetical case, but people who might go to Africa to do anthropological research, I think you said. And you said there was a problem with using the data and there would be no feedback to the people who actually were at the source of the data that was put into the study. It just occurred to me that if that data is done in a proper academic environment, there are ethics committees who judge whether a project is allowed to go ahead. So I'm worried about the example you quoted, that if people were doing that and it had not been run past any academic ethics committee, then there was a problem. It also occurred to me that maybe the people who own data broadly in ISPs should have their own ethics committee which could judge the validity of proposals or requests to use the data that they control. Maybe they should be forced to create their own internal ethics committees.
I think if corporations were to create those kinds of ethics committees, and I think many have, like Twitter has tried to do a trust and security council. So I think when they do that, I would really hope they didn't follow some of the bad things that come out in the academic model, which I think is also one of these problems where on one hand you want to use the data and do meaningful research, and I think this especially comes up with medical data where until you actually start doing the research, you don't know what you're going to use it for. It's only once you've collected the data that you think, oh, well, actually, I thought I was looking at flu, but I'm also looking at cancer. And do you then go back and ask for more consent, right? So I think when you talk to, and I've been at Harvard for the last 3 years, and this is something that keeps coming up where the scientists and the researchers and the doctors in particular are saying, if I were to actually set out all my research questions up front, I would be limiting myself. And if you don't let me actually push the boundaries of what I'm doing, then the whole exercise is pointless, and I don't know until I start meddling with the data, until I get my hands dirty. So they actually want the freedom and flexibility to leave it as broadly worded as possible, but from the research subject's point of view, they're sort of going, wait a minute, it's not sort of once you've collected it, then you can keep repurposing it for 27 reasons that I didn't actually think it, you know, I might really care about the flu because my mother died of it. I don't care if my data is used for research about other things. And I think people have weirdly idiosyncratic reasons for why they would or wouldn't give their data up, and I think sometimes those sort of competing interests get muddied up. But the example I used did actually come up. I mean, we with the engine room, with a whole bunch of others, about 15 of us actually worked on a little. We did a book sprint in 5 days and actually published a 160-page thing, which, you know, it's sort of writing a book by committee, which I didn't think was possible. You know, you can barely write one by yourself. But we actually did this, and this was one of the examples that kept coming up, that people go after Africa, they do research, and it's not necessarily in an academic scenario. It could be, and which is why I mentioned sort of NGOs and organizations where they're not bound by the sort of ethics and advisory committees that an academic institution would have. It's more people in little NGOs going off and doing little, oh, can we do a startup looking at incubators for babies and, you know, getting them to the nearest hospital. So they're not within the bounds of academia and they're not bound by those standards. So I was trying to say, can we also cover those people that are on the fringe of academia and on the fringe of corporates and sort of say, it's going to take you a while to get there, but how can we handhold you towards getting there and actually help you rather than say, look, you're doing this all wrong and we're going to penalize you. Can we actually train you? Can we say, you know, you need to have techie people, you need to get some legal help with templates, with documents, or, you know, just help you. Like Access now has a security helpline where you can ring and say, help me actually run my tech, tell me what I should be doing. You know, so they can raise a ticket for you and sort of treat you as a case and give you sort of a walkthrough of what tools and products might be suitable for you. So I think I was just trying to say, how do we build capacity and bring them on ramp to do the right thing?
Okay, thank you. Question? Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Mei Jun Lee. I'm from Taiwan, and actually I have like some kind of input because I happen to be an anthropologist who study on open government issues now. So I just want to comment on that issue, that I agree with a lot of your opinion, and that is really the issue of anthropology nowadays, that how we keep the ethical code between keep the privacy of the data we collected from our people we work with in our field, and at the same time how to make it open and make it responsible for the community that we started with. And I think this might be the similar issues that to think maybe it's not a good comparison between me and a corporation like a Facebook or something like that, but it's the same way that we can think that how a corporation to try to keep some kind of privacy of the data, but at the same time to think what's the responsibility of transparency and openness, and how is the line, the tricky line to draw between these two things and make it responsible to the whole community. And as an anthropologist, that I will do my best to do that, and I hope that to contribute to this discussion.
Okay, it sounds like we are adding another recommendation to the tech companies to create their own ethics committees for big data research. Actually, many private hospitals are required to have IRBs, institutional review boards, for conducting any research, including human bodies. And when you do research on live subjects and obtain personal data, that can be considered human body research. So a lot of social science research come through IRBs for approval. So Google has IRB? Oh, yeah. I mean, good. We are still waiting for our last panel, Go Lin Shu or Lin Shu Go, representative from Google, but I guess he cannot make it. Well, there was one. I want if Lin Shu shows up, I wanted to put Lin Shu and Anki put under the spotlight at the same time, but since Lin Shu has not come yet, I'll just put you on the spotlight and ask you this question. Right now, Facebook has a right of appeal process for account shutdowns. So if a user account shut down, their account, right. But as far as I know, there is no right of appeal for individual posting takedown or account suspension for like 24 hours. For temporary suspension, I believe there is no right of appeal. Having seen the recommendations, do you think it's appropriate for Facebook to institute right of appeal on temporary suspension and individual posting takedown?
Individual posting takedown, that's a tricky one, but I mean, it's good input for us to certainly look at. But in terms of the temporary suspension, when we do notice to the user in terms of the temporary suspension, there is detailed cause of action which is provided there in terms of reasons which are advanced in terms of the checkpointing which is done in terms of temporary suspensions, and also the user is provided guidance in terms of what the person should avoid doing, whether if the person is violating the community standards, if there's certain things which the person has done which should not be, which is in violation of the community standards. Obviously that guidance is provided. It's an awareness generating mechanism also. That we feel suffices in terms of satisfying the requirement for the user to engage with Facebook, and we feel that is an appropriate mechanism which we have. In terms of individual postings which come down, they come down because of valid reasons, and we've toyed for a while in terms of whether we should be doing notice to users, in terms of individual postings coming down, etc. That's a more long-term, complicated discussion.
So in short, she said no for temporary account suspension. Just for those of you who are curious, the question that I wanted to ask Google rep was whether Google is planning to or is willing to institute. Of course, is willing to institute right of appeal for right to be forgotten delistings because there is no right of appeal at all for right to be forgotten delistings. Facebook has a right of appeal for account shutdowns at least, and has shown up here, but Google has no right of appeal for RTBF delistings. Well, we are out of time, but since I took up the last few minutes, if there is any other question, comment, yes.
So I had a question for Sarvjit and Anki from their different perspectives. I think Sarvjit, you mentioned that 12%, only 12% of India speaks English, but 60% of the content is out there in English. And you said that more needs to be done around that. What is your perspective on the role of intermediaries in fostering that? Because a lot of it, of course, has to come up, has to come from the ground, has to come from ground up. But where do large intermediaries like Google and Facebook and Twitter, that obviously play a big part in facilitating, the sharing of content, where do you think they fall? And then I guess, Anki, from your perspective, what do you think, it's the responsibility of a company like Facebook to promote local language content?
So in terms of, if I just take the example of India, I think a lot of these companies are already doing a lot of work, and I think they have initiatives where they are like teaching people how to use the internet and providing more local level content. And in Facebook, I think is available in multiple 12 languages in India. So I guess the only point that I was making, more needs to be done. I guess it will take a lot of time, and more such efforts needs to be done, and probably different companies need to come together, because that would make it faster and more.
So I think there is all platforms are rapidly providing transliteration tools. I can talk about Facebook, what we recently did. There's a transliteration tool which we launched on the Android version of the app, which is the most pervasive platform, which is there on mobile. And that has been helpful in terms of driving conversions, in terms of just helping people. The main constraint, the main challenge which we've seen in India in terms of the net user base, people who are connected to the internet, majority of them are on feature phones, and the main constraints from an input factor perspective is the lack of local language keyboards. It's very important for people to understand that constraint factor. People just assume that the entire country is on smartphone. It is not. And that is, in fact, correct for much of South Asia. So the phone OEMs need to make sure that the input factor by way of a local language keyboard is something they're actively working on. Nokia did something in terms of a detachable local language keyboard for a variety of reasons. It didn't take off, it didn't do well. So obviously when there is no point of sale demand for that kind of stuff, companies then stop investing making that. But that has been a major constraint factor. What we're trying to do is to try and then work with phone OEMs to see if they can preload local language forms. But these things take time. I think what we can do on the app side is what we are doing. All platforms are doing, Google is doing it, we are doing it. It'll take a while.
Okay, we are out of time, and there is an exciting synthesis document session waiting to happen right now. So we'll end right now. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the panelists.